Israel's been fighting this war for 101 days. How's it doing? In short, not bad, but two formidable obstacles remain before us on our path to victory. Number one, the State Department, and number two, our security brass, which is closely coordinated with the State Department. I'll have all the details and the implications coming up on In Focus. Today, January 15th, 2024, we are on our 101st day of our war against Hamas and Iran and its other proxies following Hamas's October 7th invasion of Israel. How are we doing? Well, we can go front by front. Let's start with Gaza. So in Gaza, Israel has conquered most of northern Gaza. It's still fighting in many pockets and struggling to maintain its control because it still has to find all of the tunnel entrances. But overall, the military situation on the ground is that Israel controls northern Gaza. Southern Gaza, we'll get that in a second. First of all, central Gaza. In central Gaza, we're continuing to fight in central Gaza, but here too, we see that the tide has turned in Israel's favor, and our soldiers and officers on the ground have largely defeated Hamas's military infrastructure on the ground. In the south, the focus of battle is the town of Khan Yunis, where what we've seen is a massive nexus of underground tunnels. We believe that that is where Yahya Sinwar and Hamas's other terror bosses are currently located, together with the hostages, 136 Israeli hostages that continue to be held by Hamas. We received a sign of life from 3 of those hostages in a Hamas video yesterday, but they warned that they would tell us later today of their fate, and there's every reason to believe, given our previous experience with these hostage videos, that the fate is not all well of these 3 hostages, nor of any of the other hostages that remain in the hands of these genocidal murderers from Hamas. So 136 hostages are largely considered to be hidden in the underground tunnels in Khan Yunis, along with Hamas's senior leadership, who are using our hostages as their human shields. We marked 100 days of their captivity yesterday with ceremonies around the country, the largest of which was held in Tel Aviv at the square that has been renamed Hostages Square, where they held a 24-hour vigil for the hostages. The main problem with the major campaign in Israel to release the hostages is that it operates under the title Bring Them Home. Bring Them Home, of course, puts the obligation to find them and to release them in Israel's hands, even though they're being held by Hamas, and it really should be let them go home, because that would be putting the emphasis where it belongs, on Hamas and on Qatar and Egypt, its state sponsors effectively, or Egypt is at least facilitating Hamas, and Qatar is their state sponsor. Hamas and Qatar are essentially the same entity. And the pressure is not being placed on them. The campaign to release the hostages is being led by a man named Ronen Sur, who was one of the heads of the anti-right-wing protests that seized Israel in the 10 months leading up to the October 7th invasion, that was replete with mass campaigns on the part of the left to convince reservists not to serve in reserves under the government, and banks to boycott various things, and investors to pull their investments out of Israel, and all sorts of other insurrectionary activities. So Ronen Sur immediately began organizing on behalf of the release of the hostages, I think as early as the afternoon of October 7th. So he is putting all of the emphasis in his campaign on the Israeli government, even though obviously there's literally nobody in this country that wouldn't do anything he possibly could to release the hostages. And certainly we have tens of thousands of forces right now on the ground in Gaza, and everybody wants to release the hostages. And we have units that are dedicated to trying to find them and release them on the ground, operating day and night, and have been since the beginning of the war. At any rate, that's the situation right now. The main military target that Israel hasn't begun to operate to take over in Gaza is arguably the most important one, and the one that Israel probably should have begun with it as its first target when it began its operation in Gaza in early November. And that target, of course, is the city of Rafah, which sits along Gaza's international border with Egypt. One of the things that we've learned over the past 3 months is that Israel had misplaced faith in the Egyptian military and the Egyptian government under Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. We believe that because they're so opposed to Hamas in Egypt, and so because Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood organization, and Hamas assisted the Muslim Brotherhood in the ouster of Hosni Mubarak in 2013, and in the rise, or 12, and the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 2013, that Egypt was also opposed to Hamas in Gaza. But what we found is that the massive quantities of ammunition, of missiles, and of heavy weapons that Israel has been faced against and has found caches of in Gaza since we began our ground operation in Gaza, all of that makes clear that Egypt was not blocking Hamas from using its border to transport massive, unbelievable quantities of weapons into Gaza, but rather that they were apparently facilitating the transfer of these weapons into Gaza behind Israel's back. So that's Egypt, and Egypt has acted with great hostility towards Israel from the outset by blocking the exit of people from Gaza out of the Gaza Strip through the international border with Egypt, through Rafah, since the very beginning of the war, and threatening Israel with war if Israel opened up the border with Egypt to allow people to leave. And again, we talked about this, I think, in the past 2 shows because it's so important. The Guardian newspaper article indicating that Gazans are paying $10,000 per person in bribes to Egyptian officials to try to get on the lists of the Egyptian military of people in Gaza who are permitted to leave the Strip. They're desperate to leave. They want to leave the war zone. And the Egyptians are enabling Hamas to maintain control over Gaza by blocking the people of Gaza from seeking refuge from the war in third countries. So the main place that Israel must take control of in order to win a strategic victory, in order to block the further remilitarization of Gaza in the future, is the international border with Egypt. The only way for Israel to block Hamas's terror leaders from escaping to fight another day, to continue to lead Hamas and its military terrorist group in the further and future slaughter of Israelis and Jews, not only here in Israel, but around the world, because they're now operating around the world, as we've seen in Denmark, for instance, in an attempted attack there against Jewish targets last week that the Mossad was able to stop by informing the Danish government ahead of time. Now, if Israel doesn't take control of Rafah, even if we're able to pacify, as they say, Khan Yunis, if these people are able to escape through subterranean tunnels, they can escape through to Egypt. And so Israel, and obviously the largest fear is that they'll be able to remove the hostages from Gaza and move them to a place we'll never find them through the international border between Gaza and Egypt. So Rafah, as we call it in Hebrew, is the most important site that Israel still hasn't taken control of. And that is obviously the target that Israel must put its sights on if it wishes to defeat Hamas completely and block it from regenerating in the years to come. In fact, that is one of the key areas that Israel needs to have permanent control over in any post-war scenario in order to block the revitalization, the rebuilding, the reconstruction of Hamas's military capabilities in the future. So given the importance of Rafah, I guess you would have thought that the United States would support Israel's determination to seize Rafah, but of course the opposite is the case, just as it's been the case in every strategic goal that Israel has set for itself with Gaza. Here comes Anthony Blinken and demands that Israel not go forward. So he was here last week, and I discussed this at length last week in a column, and Anthony Blinken came here and made a series of demands against Israel towards the Netanyahu government, all of which, if accepted either individually and obviously as a group, would block Israel from achieving victory in the war. And among those things, he's very much opposed to Israel taking over Rafah. And so, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, who had in the past said that Israel's absolutely going to take control over Rafah, said on Saturday night that there are other scenarios that are being weighed to see if it's necessary. Gallant, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who's basically been lockstep with the Americans in recent weeks in a very, very unsettling way, has for, I think he threw it out over a month ago, this idea that we would just put really, really sensitive fences along the border with Egypt. This is, of course, what we did on the border with Gaza, and to such great effect that 1,200 Israelis were slaughtered on October 7th, and 240 Israelis were stolen and kidnapped into Gaza, where 136 of them still remain hostages. So, no, you can't just have high-tech border fence with high technology, and we all know that, and the fact that he's even raising this after October 7th with a straight face means that there's something seriously wrong with his ability to understand things, I guess, or at least to stand up for the country when he's facing the United States pressures. At any rate, so this now Israel has a new concept, which is that we're going to cut Gaza off south of Khan Yunis, and people are all going to be forced to move to Rafah, and we're going to build really big barriers between Khan Yunis and Rafah, and that's going to block anything from coming into the rest of Gaza. So we'll just have this pocket of Hamas in Rafah, and it's going to be cordoned off and isolated. So again, I mean, why? Because we're afraid of war with Egypt that the United States is apparently siding with Egypt on. So we're facing this weird situation where the United States is colluding with Hamas and Egypt to block Israel from taking control of the international border between Gaza and Egypt on the Gaza side of the border. The one thing that Israel needs in order to actually complete its conquest of Gaza, which we need to do in order to prevent a recurrence of what happened on October 7th. Obviously, I mean, we were invaded by an army of 2,000 terrorists supported by and joined by thousands and thousands of innocent civilians in Gaza who proceeded to slaughter and rape and kidnap and mutilate, etc., and torture thousands of Israelis. They invaded Israel. It works out from 109 different points along this vaunted high-tech fence. And we can't have a recurrence of that. So obviously we need to control Gaza in order to block it, because these people simply can't be trusted with any form of autonomy after this happened. And that that leads us to the other aspect of the U.S. position on Gaza, and more generally in relation to the Palestinians, which as a society support the genocide of Jewry and the annihilation of Israel, as we've seen. So another aspect of Tony Blinken's position that he restated and really expanded on in an extremely hostile way last week when he was here in Israel is that we need a diplomatic solution to the Palestinian problem, and the United States is serious when they say that they want a revitalized Palestinian Authority. That's the U.S.-sponsored PLO Fatah authority that Israel agreed to establish in the framework of the Oslo peace process, which has failed completely, and everybody recognizes that, except, of course, the Americans and their allies on the Israeli left. So one of the key ways that the United States is trying to push Israel to accept a strategic defeat, even as we have made all of these tactical advances in Gaza, is by demanding that Netanyahu and his cabinet put forward and agree upon a strategy for the day after the war. They started like on the first day of the war, right? October 8th, you got to put together an exit strategy. You got to put together a vision for where you see things going afterwards. And the idea of this vision, of this day after project, is to force Israel, is to compel Israel to agree not to control Gaza over time and not to walk away from this fake peace process that brought us 1,200 people dead in one day, and that brought us 1,600 people dead from 2000 until now, with over 1,000 of them killed between 2000 and 2003, because in the Palestinian terror war, because the only thing that the United States under the Biden administration is interested in is forcing Israel to accept and facilitate the establishment of a Palestinian state led by whomever, because that's what Joe Biden's top advisors have been obsessed with for the past 30 years. And that's what, the state of Michigan, where the Muslim Americans who want to see the annihilation of Israel are also demanding. So that you have this lobby. And of course, all of the foreign policy establishment in the United States, including the American Jewish community, they all are demanding the establishment of a Palestinian state, even though what we saw from Gaza is exactly what we're going to get throughout Israel, the complete annihilation of Israel, in the event that we're ever stupid enough to allow the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, which abuts central Israel, to have sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. And just, we've talked about this before, but the furthest part away from the Gaza Strip, furthest community that they reached was Ofakim, the city of Ofakim, which is 20 kilometers away from Gaza. Well, Tel Aviv is 20 kilometers away from Judea and Samaria. So we're not talking about distances that are impossible. Plus, the Palestinian Authority is far better armed than the Palestinians in Gaza were. And look at what they did. And you can only imagine what these U.S. armed forces, funded forces, trained forces in Judea and Samaria can do. But I'll get to that more in a second. At any rate, so they're demanding a diplomatic path, because what they want is one of two outcomes. Either the government says, we need to control Gaza. We're not going to allow a third party to come in, whether it's Palestinian or Arab or otherwise. The only people that we can trust with security in Gaza are ourselves. The only people who can be in charge of civil affairs and oversee the denazification, the de-jihadization process of Gaza is Israel. And if we say that, then we'll have a cleavage, we'll have a break with the Biden administration, which is fine with them, I guess, going forward. Although I actually think that that's a bluff, because they can't actually secure anything close to re-election if they're completely anti-Israel. So, that's one possibility, that Israel just says, no, we have to. The only scenario that we're dealing with right now is a scenario where we control Gaza, civil affairs and military affairs, because that's just the way it has to be. And we're also going to allow people to emigrate if they want to. Either if the Egyptians won't let them go through Egypt, they won't let them go through Israel, But they should be allowed to emigrate. And so, that's the Israeli people's desire for a post-war Gaza, which would be an Israeli-controlled Gaza. And that's been, clear in survey after survey. At any rate, so that's one option. And the other option, and the one that Biden is pushing for, is that Israel agree to his administration's vision that, on the bodies of our soldiers will come in the Palestinian Authority security forces, and they'll take over Gaza. And they'll use Gaza as a stepping stone towards a Palestinian state as well in Judea and Samaria and in Jerusalem. So here you're starting to see, and here is really the gravest threat, because the Americans continue to push this idea of a Palestinian state, including in Judea and Samaria, and in fact, first and foremost in Judea and Samaria. And the Israeli people writ large recognize that such a state would actually be an even more immediate and dangerous existential threat to Israel than even an Iranian nuclear arsenal, because uh, uh, this is a people that is genocidal. And so I don't know whether it's more dangerous, but they certainly can carry out slaughters like October 7th, but to the 10th degree. So right now, what we're seeing among the members of the war cabinet from the left-wing party led by former Chief of General Staff and former Defense Minister Benny Gantz, and with his partner, former IDF Chief of General Staff Gadi Eisenkot, is that Eisenkot is pushing this idea that Israel just walk away from Gaza and get to a hostage deal. So that's bring them home camp's representative in the war cabinet, that all Israel should do is accept defeat and then let out as many terrorists as necessary from our jails, including the murderers who slaughtered our babies on October 7th, and get back our hostages and call it a day. So that apparently is the line that Eisenkot is pushing. And Yoav Gallant, sometimes it sounds like he's pushing for us to take over Rafah. Most of the time he's not, but he is going along with the United States completely on Judea and Samaria. He's curtailing military operations there, and he's demanding that Palestinians in Judea and Samaria be allowed to work inside of Israel, even though 86% of them support what happened on October 7th, because that's an American demand. Israel transferred. It's a little bit confusing, but Israel, since the Oslo Accords, has collected customs duties for the Palestinian Authority at its port. So if somebody wants to import cars into the Palestinian Authority and they have to pay customs on it, they pay Israel, and then Israel transfers the tax revenues to the Palestinian Authority. So what Israel did was they said, look, we'll pay you all the tax revenues that you need for your terror supporting regime in Judea and Samaria, but we're not giving you the money that you're transferring every month to Gaza, because you're not going to be paying for people who work in Hamas-controlled Gaza anymore. That's done. So what the Palestinian Authority is saying, well, then we're not going to accept the money that you transferred us for the operation of Judea and Samaria, because we're going to hold our own economic well-being hostage in order to hold you hostage through the United States. So what the United States is saying to Israel is, well, the Palestinian Authority needs the money. We say to them, well, they have the money. We transferred it all to their account. And the Palestinian Authority says, we won't take the money because you're not giving us money for Hamas. And so the Americans say, you have to give them money for Gaza too. That's civil affairs. That's not terrorism. You have to pay salaries for all these people who have been subordinated to Hamas, who participated in the slaughter of October 7th. We don't care, because we want the Palestinian Authority to take the money that you collected and transferred to them, and they're not going to do it unless you also give them money to pay Hamas. So Yoav Gallant, 2 days ago, our defense minister comes out and says that he supports transferring the money to the PAs if we haven't already transferred it all, meaning he's willing to give them money to Hamas as well to continue this thing. And also he's demanding work permits be given back to the Palestinians of Judea and Samaria in order to work in Israel. And here I just want to parenthetically tell you a little story that I read this morning. So it works out that over the year preceding October 7th, a couple in Kfar Aza, one of the towns that was invaded, where you had, I think, 80 people slaughtered and many, many people taken also into captivity in Gaza on October 7th. And you had a couple that was decided to tear down their house and rebuild it. And in the meantime, they were living in rented place in the kibbutz. So the house construction was undertaken by Palestinian workers from Gaza. And they came in, and they're all, everybody's good friends and everything. They built up the house. And it was almost done in like 2 weeks after. It was supposed to be completed 2 weeks after the invasion. Well, no, yes, that's true. So what happened on October 7th is that the couple themselves were killed, and the Palestinians, they burned down that house that they had built, but they used it beforehand as their headquarters. And when the IDF took over the house that had just been built, after, the days of fighting on the kibbutz, what they found was that the Palestinian workers had, this is according to the report that I read, had built an underground cache for weapons that they were accessing. In the entire day of October 7th, they were using the house that they had built as their headquarters to go out and slaughter and kidnap the members of the kibbutz. So that the workers from Gaza came in and built this house, built it as a Hamas headquarters at the same time that they were ostensibly building a house for these Jews. And these Jews, of course, were paying them to construct their own headquarters because they were building a house. So now the idea is let the Palestinians from Judea and Samaria, who overwhelmingly support what happened on October 7th and overwhelmingly support Hamas, even more of them support Hamas in Judea and Samaria than support Hamas in Gaza, let them come in, because what the Shabbat, what the Shin Bet, and what the Central Command is saying is that, well, Judea and Samaria is a tinderbox, and if we don't give them economic prosperity, if we don't give them lots of money, and if we don't let them work in Israel, then they're going to start shooting at us with all of their guns that they have because they're our peace partners. So this is obviously extortion, but here it is. Our security brass are actually saying, you guys, Israel has to accept this extortion. So that's what's happening with the Americans and the security brass, partially out of ideological commitment to a two-state solution and partially out of this slavish following of the Americans and belief that Israel can't say no to America. They're pushing this idea that we shouldn't take over Rafah, and that as far as Judea and Samaria is concerned, well, we have to let these Palestinians into Israel and into, of course, the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria as well, to work, because otherwise, poor things, they're going to starve because, of course, the Palestinian Authority refuses to accept the money Israel already transferred to it because we're not agreeing to subsidize Gaza as well. So, and the Americans are siding with them in all of this, and then the security establishment that's subordinating itself and its desires to what Blinken dictates is saying this is what we have to do. And so the question of what happens with the international border with Gaza, with Egypt, is now being subordinated to this entire madness. And so that places not only Judea and Samaria in jeopardy, but all of Israel. Today we had, I think, our first major terrorist attack in an Israeli city since October 7th, where terrorists from Hebron, which is south, managed to get into Israel. He stole a car. He stabbed a woman. He came to the town of Ra'anana, which is just across the Green Line, but not from Hebron, from the town of Kalkilia. Anyway, he conducted car rammings in 3 different places in the city until he was stopped. And one woman was killed. I think 2 or 3 have been critically injured. And overall, I think 20 people were injured in this attack. So this is, you see how high the motivation is. This guy, his motivation to kill Jews was obviously sky high. Look at what he did. And we had another attempted infiltration of the town of Adurah in the South Hebron Hills on Friday night that was stopped by the security unit there and later by IDF forces who came. So, we are in a tinderbox, but the way to solve it is not by paying them off, as we saw on October 7th. At any rate, so that's what's happening there. And lastly, I just want to show you a video that I saw online this morning, which is, again, the United States believes in the Palestinian security forces in the Judea and Samaria and the Palestinian Authority. And here in this video, you can see that these forces that are funded by the United States, that get their weapons from the United States, etc., they're training in Algeria. Now, they're supposed to be police, but look at what they're doing. They're learning how to parachute out of airplanes. By the way, that's a Hercules airplane that they're jumping out of, which means that it's a U.S. Cargo plane that they're jumping out of in their parachuting exercises. And the question is, why do Palestinian policemen need to know how to parachute out of airplanes? It's a good question, and the answer would be important. So that's what's happening on the ground. Because of U.S. pressure, Israel isn't asserting control over civil affairs in Gaza. Hamas continues to essentially be the government in Gaza, so they're the ones distributing all of the aid, which means that Hamas is getting it all. So Israel, through U.S. pressure, is allowing Hamas to resupply its terrorists, its terror commanders, be sure that the hostages continue to be starved, and because of the United States, they continue to control the school system such as it is. They're operating the markets. So this is all Hamas because the United States doesn't want Israel to reassert the occupation of Gaza. So they're letting Hamas continue to control it as a jihadist terrorist state. And now I just want to move very quickly to Lebanon, where in Lebanon you see Amos Hochstein, again, one of our least favorite people on the Caroline Glick Show. Amos Hochstein is a U.S. presidential envoy essentially to Hezbollah. And so he's been pushing for a diplomatic solution to Hezbollah's war against Israel from the north. Just yesterday, 2 Israeli civilians, a son and a mother, in the Moshav of Kfar Yuval, were murdered by Hezbollah, which shot a Kornet anti-tank missile into their home, and they were killed. And just to be clear, the Kornet anti-tank missiles, the reason that they're so horrific is because they're sort of like cruise missiles. They travel very low, and they go very, very fast, and they can't be intercepted because they can't be seen because they're flying too low. It's not a ballistic missile with a trajectory that Israel can intercept with any of its missile defense programs. So, and now they have these extended range Kornet missiles of up to 10 kilometers, which means that the northern neighborhoods in the city of Nahariya, which is, I think, 65,000 people live there, Nahariya's northern neighborhoods are now in the range of these Kornet missiles that Israel can't intercept. So Amos Hochstein wants a diplomatic solution to this obviously military problem. I mean, Israel cannot allow, as I said, I think 2 weeks ago, Israel has 80,000 Israelis, and that doesn't include Nahariya, which hasn't been evacuated, who are currently internal refugees who can't go home until Hezbollah forces and Hezbollah missiles, including its Kornet missiles, are pushed north of the Litani River, about 30 kilometers from the border with Israel, and comes or has those missiles destroyed in a war, along with its invasion force. So here comes Amos Hochstein again for another round of mediation between Israel and Hezbollah. And the Lebanese are demanding, again, not for the first time, for the umpteenth time since 2000, when Israel removed its forces from Lebanon, that Israel, in exchange for a ceasefire with Hezbollah, give Hezbollah not only points in Rosh Nikra in the north, in the west along the Mediterranean coastline, but this place called Mount Dov. So we're looking at one of the most strategic sites in Israel, and of course Hezbollah demands it. And what the Americans are saying is, well, what we want to do is get to a diplomatic solution in this war, and in order to do that, we want to get Israel to give up its sovereign territory to Hezbollah. Now, right now, they're saying we don't accept Mount Dov, but assuming that Bashar Assad and Hassan Nasrallah, who are both Iranian proxies, come to an agreement and say, no, well, Syria is ceding its control or its rights to Mount Dov to Lebanon, then the United States may very well come in and say, okay, well, then we support it. Condoleezza Rice supported it in the past. So we're looking at a problem, a very serious problem. There's only one solution, if there is one even, to the plight of northern Israel, and that is to defeat Hezbollah and to move its forces north of Litani River, 30 kilometers north of Israel, to get northern Israel out of the range of the coordinates. And obviously, the real solution to the problem with Hezbollah is to overthrow the regime in Iran. But that's a story for another day that we'll get to. But on an immediate basis, there's no way that the residents of Kiryat Shmona or of any of the communities that have been evacuated, and really even some of the communities that haven't been evacuated in northern Israel, can be permitted to go home or can safely remain in their homes, as we saw in Kfar Yuval yesterday, so long as this threat isn't handled militarily, isn't defeated. So the United States don't want Israel to fight against Hezbollah, and they're demanding that we accept a diplomatic solution to the problem. And the main danger here is that we're already hearing the protean chorus of Israeli generals saying, well, we might be able to deal with this, it might work, it could see, we have to give a chance for a diplomatic solution. And there's no such thing. And what the United States is essentially doing is demanding that Israel accept strategic collapse in exchange for a temporary ceasefire that only exists at the pleasure of Iran and its Lebanese proxy, Hezbollah. So this is absolutely a disaster. And, when we look at this, we recognize that two main things stand in the way of an Israeli defeat, the kind that, um, you know, the United States is gunning for under Tony Blinken and the rest of the foreign policy establishment behind President Biden and, of course, President Biden himself. And that's Prime Minister Netanyahu so far is rejecting this. And, he's being pilloried by the liberal press in the United States. I saw a friend of mine in New York sent me, these screenshots from Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough and Zbigniew Brzezinski's daughter. What's her name? Mika Brzezinski on MSNBC, where all they do is attack Netanyahu and say, he's got to go, he's got to go, he's got to go all the time, he's got to go all the time. Like Brzezinski ever thought that Israel should stay, but whatever. So you have the American media is running a campaign, which, by the way, is supported by the Israeli left, trying to demonize Netanyahu and say that he's responsible for everything. It's all his fault, which is self-evidently untrue. I'm going to have to do a show about what we found out about the operational failure of the IDF since October 7th, not to mention I've already spoken about the intelligence failure. But they're trying to place all the blame on it because they're maintaining their pre-October 7th obsession, not only with Palestinian statehood, but with ousting what they view as the primary obstacle to Palestinian statehood, Benjamin Netanyahu. But of course, Benjamin Netanyahu is not there because, he stole an election. He's there because he won an election. And he won an election because the Israeli people opposed Palestinian statehood now probably more than at any time since the 1990s. So, like the idea that you can push him aside and get an Israeli government that will go along with this suicide concept of establishing a terrorist state in the middle of Israel is so hostile that it's almost unspeakable, but that's what they're doing. So they're pushing this campaign that Bibi is the problem and Bibi is the problem. And so it's Netanyahu, but more importantly, it's the people of Israel who elected him and people of Israel who today are demanding victory at all costs. You have 95% of Israelis who say that, the IDF is doing either a fantastic job or a good job, according to data that came out in a poll yesterday. And that only 11% of Israelis think that Israel should go with what Gadi Eisenkot is talking about, which is to just have a ceasefire, walk away in defeat, and cop some sort of deal to get the hostages out in exchange for terrorist murderers sitting in Israeli jails. So only 11% of Israelis support that. 5% don't have an opinion. So that's up. So that means that 84% of Israelis want to keep fighting. And so it's the Israeli people. It's Netanyahu. And at the end of the day, it's also very important, all of you, Israel's supporters in the United States. And I want to end this show just with a video, which is actually put up by pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel, frankly, anti-American group. I think it's called Veterans Against the War, something like that, on Twitter. And I saw it this morning of an anti-Israel, pro-Hamas agitator who was at a public town hall or whatever with Texas Governor Abbott, a good friend of Israel. I met him when he was here in Jerusalem, I think in 2019. And anyway, so Governor Abbott was at a public meeting, and this pro-Hamas agitator tried to block it with calls for a ceasefire, and just looked at what the good men and women of Texas thought of his efforts to bust up their meeting. So they claim that he was assaulted. I love this. I've seen it like 3 or 4 times already. They claim that he was assaulted, but really what he was trying to do was assault them by blocking them from having a public meeting. We're seeing this all over the United States, and particularly in places like New York, where you have pro-Hamas demonstrators blocking JFK Airport, and they were trying to bust up traffic on Christmas Eve so that people couldn't get to, their churches and their families. And we've seen this all, so many times now repeated since October 7th. So in Texas, they're not going to have any of that. clearly, and that's amazing. And, I think that the support that we're receiving from the American people, particularly or most openly or prominently from Christian supporters of Israel, is so important, and so important that the American people are rising up and standing with Israel. So, God bless you and thank you. This is your support is really critical at this time. And I guess one last thing that got me pretty upset was that a friend of mine pointed out to me that Barry Weiss, who's a sort of progressive a Jewish pro-Israel activist sometimes, who's been fairly good this entire war in terms of her support and the support of her publication, the Free Press for Israel. She sort of hinted at that that's about to change, or signaled that that's changing, that progressive Jewish opinion is turning on Israel now for whatever reason, when she published this article by Israel hater Andrew Sullivan called "How Many Children Is Israel Willing to Kill?" Which, you don't even have to read the article to understand what he's saying. We deliberately kill children, which of course, goes with the genocide claim against us in the Kingered Court at the Hague. So, it's very distressing to see that maybe progressive or liberal American Jews are thinking that, I don't know, it's okay to go back to embracing their anti-Israel friends at this critical moment in Israeli history, where after 101 days of war, we see what victory looks like. We've ended the beginning, maybe. I think we're at the end of the beginning, not at the beginning of the end. We're at the end of the opening stage of this war. It's a regional war. It may even be a world war. But we're right at the beginning, and if we're stopped, if we are blocked from victory, then it will be a catastrophe. Because it will be a catastrophe not only for Israel, it will be a catastrophe for the United States and for U.S. allies around the world. And so we have to stand as one. We need our supporters in the United States to stand with us. We love you for your support and thank you so much for it. And we just have to continue this fight. We don't have any other choice moving forward into our second 100 days of the war. Thanks so much, and we'll see you again later this week. Take care.